from economic reality that when it was spoken out loud in the Roosevelt Room of the White House yesterday afternoon, 3 senior advisors reportedly looked at each other and said nothing. Not because they agreed, because they were afraid. The number is $4.1 trillion. $4.1 trillion. That is the amount of money Donald Trump just demanded from the nations of NATO, not over a decade, not as a long-term restructuring goal, not as an aspirational target in a policy white paper that gets filed in a drawer and forgotten, as a bill, a literal bill payable to the United States Treasury for, quote, 7 decades of security services rendered to nations that refused to defend themselves. He stood at a podium. He held up a gold-embossed folder. He said the words that are now echoing through every chancellery, every defense ministry, every foreign affairs office on the European continent. He said NATO owes America, and the bill is due $4.1 trillion. Pay it or defend yourselves. Your choice, your choice. He gave the most important military alliance in human history, the alliance that won the Cold War, that stabilized Europe, that deterred Russian aggression for 75 years, that invoked its collective defense clause for the first and only time in history to defend America after September 11th. He gave that alliance an ultimatum, pay or leave, and then he waited. He waited for the panic. He waited for the phone calls. He waited for the European leaders to fly to Washington, one by one, checkbooks in hand, begging for terms. He's still waiting because Europe didn't panic. Europe didn't call. Europe didn't fly to Washington. Europe called Ottawa. At 6:30 a.m. Central European Time this morning, in an emergency session of the European Council convened in Brussels at a speed that hasn't been seen since the first hours of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, every head of state and government in the European Union sat in the same room and made a decision that just ended the Atlantic Alliance as we know it. They didn't vote to pay the bill. They voted to build their own military. The resolution is called the European Sovereign Defense Initiative. It is the largest single military investment in European history, $2.7 trillion over 15 years. A fully integrated European defense force with its own command structure, its own intelligence apparatus, its own satellite surveillance network, its own nuclear deterrent coordination, and its own arms procurement framework that explicitly, and I need you to hear this word, explicitly excludes American defense contractors from participation. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop, Grumman, General Dynamics, all of them locked out, blocked, banned from bidding on $2.7 trillion in European military contracts for the next 15 years. Trump demanded $4.1 trillion. Europe responded with $2.7 trillion. But the $2.7 trillion isn't going to Washington. It's going to Rheinmetall, to BAE Systems, to Thales, to Leonardo, to MBDA, to Dassault, to Airbus Defence, to every European defense company that has spent 75 years living in the shadow of the American military-industrial complex. The shadow just disappeared, and in its place is the largest defense industrial boom in European history, funded by American arrogance, architected by European resolve, and quarterbacked once again by a quiet Canadian with glasses and a spreadsheet who saw this coming 18 months ago.
If a donation makes sense for you right now, I'm asking you to pitch in to the Democratic Party's Fight Fund. Let me explain. This is how Democrats win. We win when we fight for work.
Mark Carney didn't stand at the podium in Brussels. He didn't need to. His fingerprints are on every page of the initiative. His economic models underpin the funding structure. His Commonwealth Resource Network guarantees the mineral supply chain. His back-channel diplomacy brokered the consensus between France and Germany that has eluded European leaders for 60 years. Trump demanded tribute. Carney offered architecture, and Europe chose the architect. In the next 45 minutes, I'm going to take you inside the room where this decision was made. I'm going to show you the leaked Pentagon assessment that warned 6 months ago that a NATO financial ultimatum would trigger exactly this response. I'm going to show you the Trump phone call to the NATO Secretary General that sources describe as the most destabilizing conversation in the history of the Atlantic Alliance. I'm going to show you why the stock price of every American defense contractor is in free fall this morning. I'm going to show you why 380,000 American defense workers should be updating their resumes. And I'm going to explain why this isn't Europe being ungrateful. This is Europe being European, because Europe tried gratitude for 75 years, and gratitude got them a president who sends invoices. You are watching the end of the Atlantic Alliance, not the treaty. The treaty is paper. What's dying is the purpose, the shared understanding, the invisible bond that made an ocean feel like a bridge instead of a moat. That bond is gone, and the man who severed it is about to find out that $4.1 trillion is the most expensive number ever spoken. Not because anyone is going to pay it, because the cost of saying it out loud is the loss of everything it was supposed to buy. Don't look away. Segment 1, the trigger. Let's go back 6 days. Because the $4.1 trillion demand didn't emerge from a policy review. It didn't come from the Pentagon. It didn't come from the State Department. It didn't come from any governmental process that involves data analysis or the input of people who understand how alliances work. It came from a dinner at Mar-a-Lago on a Tuesday night with 3 men whose combined diplomatic experience could fit on the back of a cocktail napkin. 6 days ago, Trump hosted a private dinner with 2 of his largest campaign donors, both of whom have significant investments in the American defense sector, and a media personality who hosts a show about geopolitical tough talk. Over dry-aged steak and what sources describe as an extraordinary amount of Diet Coke, the conversation turned to NATO. One donor reportedly said, "Mr. President, you know what burns me. We've been defending these people for 70 years, and they haven't paid a dime. If I ran a security company and a client didn't pay for 70 years, I'd send a bill. Send a bill." That's the intellectual origin of a $4.1 trillion demand on the most important military alliance in human history. A dinner table metaphor from a man who runs a hedge fund, not a strategic assessment, not an economic model, not a diplomatic initiative, a metaphor about a security company. Trump reportedly loved it. He asked his advisors the next morning to calculate the bill. He wanted a number, a big number, a number that would make headlines, a number that would dominate the news cycle, a number that would prove to his base that he was the toughest negotiator on earth. His trade team produced the number in 48 hours. The methodology, which has been partially leaked to the Financial Times, is breathtaking in its intellectual bankruptcy. They took the total U.S. military budget from 1949 to 2024, approximately $22 trillion, calculated NATO Europe's share of collective defense at roughly 18.5% based on treaty obligations, and then applied a reliability discount of 15%. Because, and this is a direct quote from the leaked methodology, European nations have consistently underperformed their defense commitments. A reliability discount. They discounted the contribution of nations that sent their soldiers to die alongside Americans in Afghanistan for 20 years. They discounted the contribution of nations that opened their airspace, their ports, their intelligence, their hospitals to American military operations for 3/4 of a century. They put a reliability discount on the blood of Allied soldiers who came home in caskets draped in European flags because America asked them to fight. The number $4.1 trillion is economically meaningless. It is diplomatically suicidal, and it is strategically catastrophic. But it is a very good number for a rally. It is a very good number for a Truth Social post. It is a very good number for the specific, narrow, self-destructive purpose of making Donald Trump feel like the biggest man in the room. And that is the problem. That has always been the problem.
With this, you can instantly clean dirty ovens and stubborn mold without any scrubbing. Take any dirty surface, spray over the grease or mold, and watch it literally melt.
The most powerful man on earth makes decisions based on what makes him feel powerful, not what makes America powerful, not what keeps the alliance strong, not what deters Russia, what makes him feel like the biggest man at the dinner table. The $4.1 trillion demand was sent to NATO headquarters through diplomatic channels on Thursday. It arrived on the desk of the NATO Secretary General with a cover letter from the U.S. ambassador that read, "The President expects a formal response within 30 days. The formal response came in 72 hours. It wasn't a check. Segment 2, the European response. Let me take you inside the room, because what happened in Brussels this morning wasn't a reaction. It was a detonation, a controlled, calibrated, surgically precise detonation that destroyed 75 years of strategic dependence in a single vote. The European Council convened at 7:00 a.m. emergency session. All 27 heads of state and government, no deputies, no substitutes, every leader in the room. The agenda had one item: response to U.S.-NATO financial ultimatum. The session was chaired by the European Council President. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, was seated beside him. She had prepared a 47-page proposal, the European Sovereign Defense Initiative. She had been working on it for 14 months, quietly, secretly, waiting for the moment. Trump gave her the moment. The first leader to speak was Emmanuel Macron. The French president stood and said, "For 75 years, Europe has outsourced its defense to the United States. We did this because we trusted the United States. We trusted that the partnership was mutual. We trusted that the protection was genuine. We trusted that the leader of the free world would never treat the alliance as a protection racket. That trust is gone. The bill on my desk is not a negotiating position. It is an eviction notice, and I will not be evicted from my own continent." Then Olaf Scholz spoke. The German chancellor, a man known for caution, for hesitation, for the kind of deliberative temperament that makes for good governance and boring television, stood and said words that the German foreign ministry later confirmed were unscripted. He said, "Germany has paid for the American alliance in ways that do not appear on any invoice. We paid with our sovereignty. We paid with our foreign policy independence. We paid with our willingness to follow American leadership, even when that leadership was wrong. We did this because we believed in the partnership. We believed we were allies. We are no longer allies. We are debtors. And Germany does not accept invoices from nations that have forgotten the meaning of the word partner." The room was silent for 4 seconds after Scholz finished. 4 seconds is an eternity in a room full of heads of state. Then one by one, every leader in the room endorsed the initiative: Poland, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland. The Baltic states, who have more reason than anyone to fear Russian aggression and who have relied on American security guarantees more than anyone, voted yes. The Baltic states voted yes: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. 3 nations that share borders with Russia, 3 nations that have spent the last 2 years living under the shadow of Russian military aggression. 3 nations that have the most to lose if American protection disappears. They voted to build European defense. They voted to replace American dependence with European capability. They voted despite the risk, despite the fear, despite the geographical reality that Russia is right there, because they concluded that the risk of depending on Donald Trump is greater than the risk of depending on themselves. That is the most devastating verdict on the Trump presidency that has ever been delivered. When the nations most vulnerable to Russian attack choose European defense over American protection because they trust Europe more than they trust Washington, the American security guarantee has lost its meaning. 27-2 are unanimous. Not a single holdout, not a single abstention, not a single nation that said, "Wait, maybe we should give Trump another chance." Another chance. He's had 8 years of chances, 2 terms, 2 rounds of NATO ultimatums, 2 rounds of threats to withdraw, 2 rounds of calling allies freeloaders and deadbeats and ungrateful parasites, and now a $4.1 trillion invoice. The chances are over. The patience is exhausted. And 27 European democracies just decided together to build a future that doesn't require American permission. Segment 3, the receipts. We do evidence here: math, documents, data, the things that survive when the spin dissolves. Let's look at the receipts. Receipt 1, the Pentagon warning. 6 months ago, the Office of the Secretary of Defense's policy planning staff completed a classified assessment titled NATO Cohesion under Financial Stress Alliance Response Modeling. The assessment was partially leaked to Defense One and independently confirmed by 2 sources with direct knowledge. The assessment modeled various scenarios for U.S. financial demands on NATO allies. It explicitly warned that demands exceeding $500 billion in aggregate would, quote, trigger a consolidation response rather than a compliance response. It warned that European leaders would interpret extreme financial demands not as a negotiation, but as a termination, and would respond by accelerating European defense autonomy rather than increasing payments to Washington. The assessment's most devastating finding, a unilateral U.S. financial ultimatum to NATO, risks the most significant strategic reversal since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The probable European response is not capitulation, but consolidation, the creation of a European defense capability that permanently reduces U.S. influence on the continent. Permanently, not temporarily, not until the next administration. Permanently. This assessment was included in the president's intelligence briefing. An aide summarized it verbally. Trump reportedly said, "They'll pay. They always pay. They're scared of Russia. Where else are they going to go? Where else are they going to go?" He asked that question, and this morning, 27 nations answered it. They're going to each other. Receipt 2, the $2.7 trillion blueprint. Let me show you what Europe is actually building, because the European Sovereign Defense Initiative isn't a press release, it's a blueprint. A 340-page, technically detailed, fully funded, legally binding blueprint for European military self-sufficiency. The initiative has 5 pillars.
This tiny little camera just made my $1,500 home security system completely useless. It's smaller than a deck of cards.
Pillar 1, the European Rapid Reaction Force, 300,000 troops drawn from all 27 member states, deployable within 10 days to any point on the European continent or its periphery. Command structure independent of NATO, independent satellite communications, independent logistics. Pillar 2, the European Defense Manufacturing Corridor, a continent-wide arms production network linking factories in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Poland, Sweden, and the Czech Republic. Standardized ammunition, standardized vehicles, standardized communications equipment, all of it built to European specifications, not American specifications. Every bullet, every tank, every fighter jet built in Europe by Europeans for Europeans, without a single American component, without a single American license, without a single American veto. Pillar 3, the European Intelligence Sovereignty Network, an independent signals intelligence and satellite surveillance system. No NSA integration, no Five Eyes dependency, European-built satellites, European-operated ground stations, European analyzed data. The most important intelligence architecture built in Europe since the Cold War, designed specifically to function without American participation. Pillar 4, the Nuclear Deterrent Coordination Framework. France and the United Kingdom, both nuclear powers, formalize a coordinated European nuclear deterrent. This doesn't create new nuclear weapons. It creates a European-controlled nuclear command structure that operates independently of NATO's nuclear planning group, which is dominated by the United States. For 75 years, Europe's nuclear deterrent has been American. American bombs stored on European soil, American codes, American permission. Under the initiative, Europe's nuclear deterrent becomes European. French warheads, British submarines, European command authority. Trump wanted to monetize the nuclear umbrella. Europe just built its own umbrella. Pillar 5, the Critical Minerals and Supply Chain Security Compact. And here is where Mark Carney's fingerprints become visible. The initiative includes a binding supply chain agreement between the EU and the Commonwealth Resource Network. Canadian rare earths, Australian lithium, Brazilian niobium, Indian titanium, all flowing to European defense manufacturers under 20-year supply contracts. Carney built the supply chain, Europe builds the weapons, and the United States, which has supplied European military since 1949, is locked out of the most lucrative defense market on earth. Receipt 3, the market verdict. The market. Money screamed this morning. Let's listen. The moment the European Sovereign Defense Initiative was announced, the financial markets delivered a verdict that should be tattooed on the wall of the Oval Office. European defense stocks exploded. RIN metals surged 16.7%. BAE Systems up 12.4%. Bailey's up 11.8%. Leonardo up 13.2%. Dalt Aviation up 14.1%. MBDA up 15.6%. The European defense sector gained $234 billion in market value in a single session, the largest single-day gain in European industrial history. Now look at the American side. Lockheed Martin dropped 11.3%. The worst single-day performance since the 2008 financial crisis. Boeing Defense dropped 9.7%. Raytheon dropped 8.4%. Northrop Grumman dropped 7.8%. General Dynamics dropped 6.9%. The American defense sector shed $189 billion in market value. $189 billion. That is the market's assessment of what Trump's $4.1 trillion demand actually cost. Not $4.1 trillion flowing into the Treasury, $189 billion flowing out of American defense companies. Trump's demand didn't make money for America. It destroyed money for America. The defense industrial base, the sector that Trump claims to champion, the sector that employs 2.1 million Americans, the sector that is supposed to be the backbone of American power, just had its worst day in 16 years because the president sent an invoice to the customers who buy its products. You don't invoice your customers and expect them to keep buying from you. That's not business. That's economic suicide. And the market just priced in the suicide. Receipt 4, the Carney press conference. 3 hours after the European vote, Mark Carney held a press conference in Ottawa. It lasted 9 minutes. 9 minutes that will be studied in diplomatic and economic courses for the next century. He didn't mention Trump's name. He didn't mention the $4.1 trillion. He didn't mention NATO. He spoke only about the Commonwealth Resource Network's expanded partnership with the European Defense Manufacturing Corridor. He said Canada is proud to provide the critical mineral supply chains that will power Europe's defense industrial renaissance. Our rare earth processing facilities in Ontario, our nickel refineries in Sudbury, our uranium enrichment capabilities in Saskatchewan. These assets are now integrated into the European sovereign defense supply chain under binding 20-year agreements. This partnership ensures that the democratic world can defend itself with resources sourced exclusively from democratic nations. No nation should be dependent on any single partner for its security. Independence is not disloyalty, it is maturity. Independence is not disloyalty, it is maturity. That sentence is the epitaph of the Atlantic Alliance. Not a bitter epitaph, not an angry epitaph, a calm.
Why you should never cover your credit card with tin foil. I've worked at a major bank for 14 years. Just yesterday,
Measured, mathematically precise epitaph delivered by a man who sees the world through spreadsheets and acts through contracts. A reporter asked, "Prime Minister, is NATO dead?" Carney adjusted his glasses. He looked at the reporter, then he looked past the reporter into the camera at you. He said, "NATO is a treaty. Treaties survive on paper. Alliances survive on trust. I cannot comment on the state of trust between any two nations. I can only say that Canada builds partnerships with nations that treat partnership as a mutual commitment, not a billing arrangement, not a billing arrangement." 7 words that separate a world leader from a debt collector. 7 words that explain why 27 nations voted to build their own military. 7 words that explain why $189 billion in American defense value evaporated in a single morning. Trump sent a bill. The world sent a verdict. Segment 4, the psychological breakdown. Let me explain why Donald Trump demanded $4.1 trillion from NATO. Not the stated reason, the real reason. Trump operates on a psychological model that psychologists call transactional narcissism. Every relationship is evaluated based on one criterion. What is this person giving me? If the answer is not enough, the relationship is redefined as exploitation. If the relationship is redefined as exploitation, the response is punishment. Trump looks at NATO and sees exploitation. He sees American troops on European soil. He sees American missiles protecting European cities. He sees American taxpayers funding American defense budgets. And he asks, what are they giving me? Not, what are they giving America? What are they giving me? Because in Trump's psychological framework, he is America. The nation and the man are indistinguishable. An insult to Trump is an insult to America. A failure to pay Trump is a failure to pay America. A rejection of Trump is a rejection of America. This conflation of self and state is the most dangerous feature of his psychology because it means every policy decision is filtered through personal emotion. The $4.1 trillion demand isn't a strategic calculation. It's a feeling. The feeling that he is owed. The feeling that the world takes from him without giving back. The feeling that respect is measured in dollars and the dollar amount is never high enough. $4.1 trillion is not a number derived from analysis. It's a number derived from ego. It's big enough to make headlines, big enough to dominate a news cycle, big enough to make Trump feel like the most powerful man at the table, and it's big enough to destroy the alliance that has kept the peace in Europe since 1949. Because here's what Trump's psychology cannot accommodate: the concept that some things are too expensive to demand, that some prices, when spoken out loud, destroy the thing they're trying to buy, that the act of sending an invoice to your allies transforms allies into customers, and customers shop around. $4.1 trillion was the price of the invoice. The cost of sending it is the loss of the alliance. Now look at Europe's response. Look at the psychology of the other side. Europe's psychology on defense has been frozen since 1945. For 75 years, the European posture has been America protects us. We follow America's lead. We accept America's terms. We absorb America's insults because the alternative, defending ourselves, is too expensive, too risky, and too politically difficult. That freeze just thawed in a single vote because Trump didn't just insult them, he invoiced them. He put a dollar amount on the relationship. And when you put a dollar amount on a relationship, you transform it from an alliance into a transaction. And transactions can be terminated. The $4.1 trillion didn't just offend European leaders. It liberated them. It gave them the political justification to do something they've been afraid to do for 75 years, stand on their own feet. Every European leader who has ever argued for strategic autonomy, every defense minister who has ever proposed an independent European military, every think tank analyst who has ever published a paper on European defense sovereignty, all of them have been waiting for this moment, not waiting for Europe to be strong enough, waiting for America to be insulting enough, waiting for the provocation that would break the psychological dependency, waiting for the moment when the cost of American protection exceeded the cost of self-reliance. Trump provided that moment. He provided it with a gold-embossed folder and a number that reads like a ransom. And Europe, freed from the psychological cage of American dependency, is now building with a speed and determination that hasn't been seen since the post-war reconstruction. Carney saw this coming. He saw it 18 months ago when he started building the Commonwealth Resource Network. He knew that Trump's psychology would eventually produce a demand so extreme that it would break the alliance. He didn't know the number. He didn't need to. He just needed to build the infrastructure that Europe would need when the break came. The mineral supply chains, the processing capacity, the energy partnerships, the financial architecture, all of it ready, all of it waiting, all of it designed to plug seamlessly into a European defense system that didn't exist until this morning. Carney didn't cause the break. Trump caused the break. Carney just made sure that when the break came, the pieces fell toward Ottawa instead of into chaos. That is the difference between a strategist and a showman. The showman causes the earthquake. The strategist builds on the rubble. Segment 5, the consequences for you. Let me bring this to your job, your taxes, your retirement, your security. Because a European defense initiative sounds like it happens on a continent you visit for vacation. But the consequences don't stay in Europe. They cross the Atlantic and they land on your paycheck, your job. The American defense industry employs 2.1 million people directly and supports another 3.44 million jobs indirectly. These aren't just engineers and executives. These are machinists in Connecticut, welders in Texas, electricians in Georgia, software developers in Virginia, security guards in California, cafeteria workers in Maryland. The defense industry sustains entire communities, towns where the factory is the town, towns where every restaurant, every gas station, every school depends on the paychecks that flow from defense contracts.
I have a 134 IQ. I make less money than friends who barely passed high school. Here's what I find.
Canada just declared economic independence from the United States. I'm not exaggerating. What was announced today is the biggest geopolitical shift in North American history, and I've been digging through the details for hours, trying to understand the full scope of what this means. So here's what just happened. The Canadian Prime Minister just announced he's leaving for a massive trade mission. But this isn't your typical diplomatic visit. This is a full-scale pivot away from America. He's heading to India, Australia, and Japan for 12 days. And the goal is crystal clear: replace the United States as Canada's primary economic partner. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture, because this announcement came just hours after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down some of the tariffs that have been hammering Canadian exports. You'd think that would be good news, right? You'd think Canada would take a breath and try to negotiate with Washington. Instead, they doubled down on moving away from America entirely. Let me break down what's actually happening here, because the timeline tells you everything. For over a year now, the relationship between Canada and the United States has been in complete freefall. We're talking about a trade war that started with threats to make Canada the 51st state. I know that sounds insane, but that's literally what's been happening. The US president has repeatedly said he wants Canada to become part of America. And when the Canadian government pushed back, he responded with tariffs, massive tariffs. We're talking 25% on most goods, 35% on some sectors, and at one point threats of 100% tariffs if Canada made deals with China. And here's where it gets complicated. Canada didn't just sit there and take it. They went to China. In January, the Canadian Prime Minister flew to Beijing and signed a deal to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6%. At the same time, China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola oil. This was a direct middle finger to Washington, and the U.S. president went ballistic. He threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if that China deal went through. But that's not even the real story, because what nobody's talking about is how calculated this pivot has been. This isn't a panic move. This has been in the works for months. Last month at the World Economic Forum, the Canadian PM gave a speech that basically told the world that the old rules don't apply anymore. He said, "We're living in a rupture of the global order, and that middle powers like Canada need to stop waiting for superpowers to protect them and start building their own alliances." Wait, it gets worse, because the US president heard that speech, and his response was to say, Canada lives because of the United States. Think about that for a second. That's not diplomacy. That's a threat, and Canada heard it loud and clear. So now we're at today. The announcement just came out. Starting February 26th, the Canadian PM is going to Mumbai and New Delhi first. He's meeting with the Indian Prime Minister, and they're going to formalize negotiations on a massive trade deal. The goal, double trade between the two countries from $31 billion to $70 billion by 2030. That's a staggering number. India is the world's fastest growing major economy, and Canada wants in. Then he flies to Australia, and this is the part that kept me up last night. He's going to address both houses of Australia's parliament. This hasn't happened in 20 years. The last time a Canadian Prime Minister did this was back in 2006. Why does that matter? Because when you address a foreign parliament, you're not just making nice, you're signaling a strategic partnership. Australia has what Canada needs: critical minerals, advanced tech partnerships, and a shared interest in countering Chinese influence in the Pacific. But more importantly, Australia is looking for alternatives to relying solely on the United States too. And then Japan. The final stop is Tokyo. Clean energy partnerships, advanced manufacturing, food security deals. Japan is the world's fourth largest economy, and they're desperately trying to diversify away from Chinese supply chains. Canada has the resources Japan needs: uranium, rare earth minerals, agricultural products. Here's what nobody's talking about, though. All three of these countries, India, Australia, Japan, are part of what's being called the Indo-Pacific strategy. And guess who's not the main player in that strategy anymore? The United States, at least not in the way it used to be. This is the part where you need to understand the numbers. Right now, Canada exports about $600 billion worth of goods to the United States every year. That's roughly 75% of all Canadian exports. The Canadian government has set a goal to double non-US exports to $600 billion over the next decade.
My neighbor reported me for unsafe snow removal equipment after watching this clear his driveway through my fence.
Think about what that means. They're trying to build an entirely parallel economy. that doesn't depend on America, and the U.S. knows this. That's why the tariffs have been so aggressive. That's why there's been talk of blocking the opening of a new bridge between Detroit and Windsor. The U.S. is trying to squeeze Canada back into dependence, but Canada is calling that bluff. Now, what I'm about to show you is why this matters to you, even if you don't live in Canada or the U.S., because this isn't just about trade numbers. This is about something much bigger. What's happening right now is a complete reorganization of global power, and Canada just became the test case for what happens when a country decides it doesn't want to be dependent on a superpower anymore. Let me show you exactly how this works. When the Canadian PM goes to India next week, he's not just signing papers. He's bringing a delegation of business leaders. We're talking energy companies, tech firms, mining corporations, and they're going there with specific objectives. India needs energy desperately. They're projected to need 70% more energy by 2040. Canada has natural gas, uranium, clean energy tech. India needs food security. Canada is one of the world's largest agricultural exporters. But here's where it gets complicated. India has been buying most of its oil from Russia. After the war in Ukraine started, India actually increased imports from Russia to 37% of all their oil. But those imports dropped 18% recently because of European sanctions. That created an opening, and Canada's walking right through it. Now, what I'm about to tell you changes the whole dynamic, because this isn't just about replacing Russian oil. This is about Canada positioning itself as the supplier for the entire developing world. India is the gateway. If Canada can lock in long-term energy contracts with India, they can use that as leverage with other Asian economies, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand. All of these countries are looking to diversify away from Chinese and Russian suppliers. And then there's the tech angle. This is what people are missing. At the G20 summit last year, Canada, India, and Australia formed something called the AID Partnership. That's the Australia, Canada, India Technology and Innovation Partnership. What does that actually mean? It means they're pooling resources to develop artificial intelligence, nuclear energy tech, and critical mineral supply chains. And they're doing it without the United States. Let me pause here because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this can't work. You're thinking Canada is too dependent on the U.S. to actually pull this off. And look, I get it. The numbers are brutal. Nearly $4 billion worth of goods crosses the U.S.-Canada border every single day. 60% of all U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. 85% of U.S. electricity imports. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to America. But that's not even the real story, because what nobody's talking about is that the dependence goes both ways. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. 36. If Canada successfully diverts even 20% of its trade to Asia and Europe, those states are going to feel it hard. And a lot of those states are politically critical swing states. Here's what I found when I was digging into this. The U.S. president has threatened tariffs, but he's also been trying to block specific infrastructure projects. There's this bridge called the Gordie Howe International Bridge. It's been under construction for years. It's supposed to be the biggest crossing between the U.S. and Canada. And earlier this month, the U.S. president said he's going to delay the opening because he doesn't like the terms of the contract. He said Canada gets all the toll revenue, which isn't true, but facts don't seem to matter anymore. Wait, it gets worse, because this bridge was entirely funded and built by Canada. The U.S. didn't put a single dollar into it, but now they want to renegotiate the deal or block it from opening.
People are quietly switching to this reliable home power setup. It keeps everything essential running strong.
Why? Because they know that bridge represents economic independence. It's a direct route for Canadian goods to reach ports on the East Coast and bypass traditional U.S.-controlled corridors. Now let me show you the Australia piece, because this is where the strategy gets really clear. When the Canadian PM addresses Australia's parliament, he's going to be talking about defense cooperation, but not the kind of defense cooperation you're thinking of. This is about maritime security in the Pacific. Australia has been building up its navy to counter Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. Canada wants in on that, not because they care that much about the South China Sea, but because being part of that alliance gives them leverage. Here's what's actually happening. Australia, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly Canada are forming what some analysts are calling the Quad Plus. It's a defense and economic alliance specifically designed to counter both Chinese aggression and American unpredictability. And yes, I said American unpredictability because what the last year has proven is that you can't rely on the United States to maintain stable relationships, even with its closest allies. And then there's the critical minerals component. This is huge. Australia has lithium, rare earths, cobalt. Canada has uranium, graphite, nickel. Together, they can control a significant portion of the global supply chain for batteries, nuclear energy, and advanced electronics. And they're deliberately cutting China out while also not making themselves dependent on U.S. processing facilities. This is the part that kept me up last night, because if Canada and Australia can lock down critical minerals and build their own processing infrastructure, they don't need America or China for the next generation of technology. They become the gatekeepers. But here's the problem, and it's a big one. This whole strategy depends on speed. The longer it takes to build these alternative relationships, the more leverage the U.S. has to crush them. And the U.S. knows this. That's why we're seeing escalating tariffs, infrastructure blockades, and increasingly hostile rhetoric. Now, what I'm about to show you is where Japan fits into this and why the timing of this trip is absolutely critical, because Japan is the missing piece that makes this entire strategy either brilliant or catastrophic. And I've been trying to figure out which one it is. Here's what you need to understand. Japan is in a really weird position right now. They've been America's closest ally in Asia for 80 years, but the current U.S. administration has made it clear that alliance doesn't mean what it used to mean. Japan watched as the U.S. threatened South Korea with tariffs unless they paid $350 billion for the privilege of keeping U.S. troops on their soil. Japan saw the U.S. try to coerce Canada into becoming the 51st state. And Japanese leadership is asking themselves a very reasonable question. Are we next? So when the Canadian PM lands in Tokyo, he's going to be walking into a country that's quietly terrified of what American foreign policy looks like now. And Canada is offering an alternative, not a replacement for the U.S.-Japan alliance, but a parallel structure that doesn't depend on American goodwill. Let me break down what's on the table. Japan needs food security. They import 60% of their food.
My security guy is going to hate me for posting this. This tiny little camera just made my 1,500.
Canada is offering long-term agricultural contracts. Japan needs energy. They're almost entirely dependent on imported natural gas and oil. Canada has liquefied natural gas infrastructure that can ship directly to Tokyo. Japan needs rare earth minerals for their tech industry. Canada and Australia can supply that. But here's where it gets complicated, because Japan is also deeply integrated into U.S. supply chains. Toyota, Sony, Hitachi, all of these companies have massive operations in the United States. If Japan pivots too hard toward this Canada-Australia alliance, the U.S. could retaliate with tariffs that would devastate Japanese exports. And this is where the gamble comes in. Canada is betting that by the time the U.S. realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it. They're betting that India, Australia, and Japan can form a trading bloc that's large enough and powerful enough that the U.S. has to accept it as a reality. Now, what nobody's talking about is the timeline. This trip is happening February 26 to March 7. That's 12 days. But there's another date that matters even more, July 1st, 2026. That's when the USMCA, the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, is up for review. And right now, nobody knows if it's going to be renewed. Think about what that means. If that agreement expires, the U.S. could impose tariffs on Canadian goods with no restrictions at all. We could be looking at 50, 60, 70% tariffs on everything from cars to maple syrup. The Canadian economy would be hit harder than it's been hit since the Great Depression. So Canada is in a race. They need to get these alternative trade deals locked in before July, because if July comes and the USMCA collapses, Canada needs to be able to turn to India, Australia, and Japan and say, we don't need America anymore. But here's the twist, and it's a big one. The U.S. knows this. The Supreme Court just struck down a bunch of the emergency tariffs the president was using. You'd think that would be good news for Canada, but instead the president immediately imposed a new 15% global tariff using a different law, and he's made it clear he's going to keep finding ways to punish Canada economically until they back down. Wait, it gets worse, because the president has also started targeting specific Canadian provinces. Ontario ran an ad in the US that used clips of Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs. The president's response, he threatened to increase tariffs on Ontario by 10%. And then when the Canadian government announced their China deal, he threatened 100% tariffs on everything. This is not normal. This is economic warfare. And Canada is trying to fight back by building alliances faster than the US can tear them down. Now, let me show you the numbers that make this even more insane. Canada's goal is to double non-US exports to $600 billion by 2035. Right now, they're at about $300 billion. That means they need to find $300 billion worth of new trade over the next 9 years. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire GDP of Denmark. They need to build an economy the size of Denmark in less than a decade.
Right now, as you watch this, your brain is being hijacked. You think you're in control.
And they're trying to do it while under active economic attack from the world's largest economy. Here's what I found when I was looking at the provincial responses. Ontario, which is Canada's largest province, has stopped buying American alcohol. They pulled every US wine, beer, and spirit from their liquor stores. Nova Scotia doubled the tolls for American trucks using their highways. British Columbia is reviewing all government contracts to eliminate purchases from US companies. These are not symbolic gestures. These are coordinated economic countermeasures. But here's the problem, and it's the biggest problem of all. Even with India, Australia, and Japan, even with new trade deals and diversification, Canada cannot replace $600 billion worth of exports to the United States in 9 years. It's not mathematically possible. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The shipping routes aren't built. The relationships aren't deep enough. So what's really happening here? Is Canada actually trying to replace the US as a trading partner, or are they trying to build enough leverage to force the US to negotiate? This is the part where I have to be honest with you. I don't know. I've been trying to figure this out for hours, and I genuinely don't know if this is a bluff or if Canada is serious about decoupling from the American economy. What I do know is this. The next 2 weeks are going to tell us everything. If the Canadian PM comes back from this trip with signed agreements in India, Australia, and Japan, we're looking at a fundamental reorganization of global trade. If he comes back with vague promises and photo ops, then this was all theater. But there's one more thing, and it's the thing that makes me think this is real. The Canadian government just announced a $70 billion investment deal with the United Arab Emirates. $70 billion. That's not a symbolic number. That's real money flowing into Canadian infrastructure, energy, and tech. And it's coming from a country that traditionally aligns with American interests. Now, what I'm about to show you is what happens next and why the outcome of this trip could reshape everything we thought we knew about North American relations. Because here's what nobody's prepared for. If Canada actually pulls this off, it changes the entire calculus of global power. And I mean that literally. Think about it this way. For the last 80 years, the entire Western alliance has been built on one assumption, that the United States is the irreplaceable center of the global economy, that if you're a democracy, if you believe in free trade and open markets, you have to align with Washington because there's no alternative. Canada is testing whether that's still true, and the answer they're about to get will determine the future of every middle power on the planet. Let me show you why this matters beyond just Canada. South Korea is watching this. They just paid $350 billion to keep US troops on their soil, and they're asking themselves if that was necessary or if they got extorted. The European Union is watching. They've seen the US threaten tariffs on them, threaten to pull out of NATO, threaten to abandon Ukraine. Every single US ally is doing the same calculation Canada is doing. Can we survive without America? And what Canada is trying to prove is that the answer is yes. Not easily, not without pain, but
If a donation makes sense for you right now, I'm asking you to pitch in to the Democratic Party's fight.
But yes, Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because if Canada succeeds, you're going to see other countries try the same thing. Mexico is already looking at it. They've been hit with the same tariffs Canada has. They're part of the same threatened trade agreement, and Mexico has something Canada doesn't, a massive cheap labor force that could absorb a lot of manufacturing that's currently in China. If Mexico and Canada both successfully diversify away from the United States, NAFTA is dead. And if NAFTA is dead, the entire concept of North American economic integration collapses. We'd be looking at 3 separate economies instead of one integrated bloc. But here's the twist. The US might not actually care, because what I've been seeing in the rhetoric from Washington is that there's a faction that genuinely believes America doesn't need trading partners. They believe the US can just impose tariffs, force companies to build factories in America, and bring back the manufacturing economy of the 1950s. The problem is, that's not how modern economies work. You can't just will supply chains back into existence. You can't tariff your way to prosperity when your entire economy is built on importing cheap components and exporting high-value finished goods. But that economic reality hasn't stopped the political will, and that's what makes this so dangerous, because what we're watching is 2 completely different visions of how the world should work, and they're on a collision course. Let me break down the actual endgame scenarios here, because there are really only 3 ways this plays out. Scenario 1, Canada's bluff gets called. They go on this trade mission, they get some preliminary agreements, but when it comes time to actually implement them, the numbers don't work. The US maintains enough economic leverage that Canadian businesses can't afford to shift away. The alternative markets aren't large enough or profitable enough, and Canada quietly backs down, negotiates a new trade deal with the US, and accepts whatever terms they can get. In this scenario, the US wins, but the relationship is permanently damaged. Canada becomes a reluctant dependent rather than a willing partner. Scenario 2, Canada succeeds, but slowly. They build out these alternative relationships over the next decade. Trade with India, Australia, and Japan grows, but not fast enough to replace the US. We end up in a hybrid situation where Canada is diversified enough that they can't be completely coerced, but not independent enough to tell the US to back off entirely. This is probably the most realistic scenario, but it's also the most unstable, because you'd have ongoing tension, ongoing tariff battles, and no clear winner. Scenario 3, this escalates into a full economic war. The US imposes massive tariffs. Canada retaliates by cutting off critical resources. We're talking oil, electricity, uranium. The US has to find alternative suppliers, which takes years and costs hundreds of billions. Canada's economy takes a massive hit in the short term, but emerges more independent in the long term. This is the worst-case scenario for both countries, but it's not impossible. In fact, with the way things are going, it might be more likely than people think. And here's what terrifies me about scenario 3, because if that happens, it doesn't just hurt the US and Canada. It destabilizes the entire global economy. Supply chains collapse, energy markets spike, food prices go up, and every other country has to choose sides. Now, what I'm about to tell you is where I think this is actually heading, and I could be completely wrong, but here's my read. I think Canada is serious. I think they've looked at the last year of chaos and threats and decided that betting their entire economy on American stability is too risky. I think they're willing to take short-term economic pain to build long-term independence. But I also think they're hoping they don't have to. I think the real goal here is to build enough leverage that when the USMCA comes up for review in July, Canada can walk into those negotiations and say, we don't need this deal as badly as you think we do. And if that works, if the US blinks and offers reasonable terms, then everybody wins. The trade relationship continues, but on more balanced terms. Canada gets the security of diversified trading partners, and the US keeps its largest trading partner. But if the US doesn't blink, if they double down on tariffs and threats, then we're in uncharted territory, because Canada will have to decide if they're willing to go through with this pivot entirely. And that's a decision that will define North American relations for the next 50 years. So here's where we are. In 3 days, the Canadian Prime Minister gets on a plane. 12 days later, we'll have a much better idea of whether this is real or theater, and by July, we'll know if the North American alliance survives or if we're watching it collapse in real time. I'm curious what you think about this. Does Canada have any real chance of pulling this off, or is this just a negotiating tactic that's going to backfire? Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear different perspectives on.
Do you want to know where to invest $1,000 right now? Well, forget about AI, quantum computing,
Canada just declared